there. We have got a small lesson today, but it's an important one. This comes from the Old Testament, book of Genesis, chapter 4. Up until this point in the early part of the Bible, God has created the world and He's created people. They have not done a very good job at following Him. So, Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, were kicked out of Eden. Adam was going to have to work the land in order to gain food for them and whatever children they might have. Now, what we have is a situation where most people think that Cain and Abel were the first two people born on the earth. Um, the Bible doesn't say that. Now, what it does say, and the way it says it, is how Eve was so grateful to have a baby when she had Cain, when Cain was born, that most people will acknowledge, okay, that sounds a lot like that was her first child and they had a boy. Okay, well, it's definitely a boy, and it probably was the first child. And then later they had another boy and they named him Abel. So we don't know if there were other children in between because Abel has a special um, way about him. There's something different between the two boys, Cain and Abel. And that's what the Bible focuses on. And that's really where uh, we see what's important, not so much as to whether or not there were other children immediately or other children after Abel, because there were definitely other children who were born. In fact, we could say there were a lot of children that Adam and Eve had. It's just the Bible doesn't feel it necessary to go into detail about all of the children, because what we've got here is that um, Cain is a farmer like his father, and Abel raises sheep. And you think, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense because they would need food, so they would get some from growing it and some from the sheep. Well, at this time, people were not allowed to eat meat. They were not allowed to kill animals for food. So that then makes you wonder, okay, why would they raise sheep? Ah, when we go back into where Adam and Eve had disobeyed God, part of that you may recall, and it's usually pretty funny to most people, is they realized they weren't wearing any clothes, and so they hid and they tried to use leaves and all that, and then God had to provide for them, and that resulted in a couple of animals dying so that they could wear the skins of the animals. Well, with sheep, you can trim their hair, which we call wool, and make that into clothing, and people have done that for thousands of years. And wool has a lot of good things going for it when you need clothing. So that would have been the main reason for them to raise sheep. And even up through the time of Jesus, even though people, and beyond the time of Jesus, people would, yes, eat some of the meat later on, but the main thing was to get the wool for the clothing because clothing was extremely expensive and hard to come by. So it was important to have this. You uh, didn't want to have to kill an animal every time you needed something to wear, and you couldn't be putting together leaves and things all of the time. So that would be the main reason for it. Secondary reason might be for milk that they could derive from the sheep. So, maybe not, but that is a distinct possibility. Okay, as they did these things, as Cain raised crops, as Abel raised sheep, there would come a time, and we don't know if this was a particular time or just ongoing. We find that Cain would take some of the things that he had grown and uh, give it to God. He would devote it to God, and I'm not sure how he did that. Doesn't mean they burned it up or he just put it out and gave it to God. We don't know, but something along those lines that They were not using it for seed, they were not using it for food, but returning it as a way of worshiping God. Now, that sounded pretty good until we find out what Abel did. Abel was giving the best of his sheep, what's called the first fruits, meaning the first and the best. He's giving that to God. And God accepted Abel's gift, but not Cain's. And we look at that and you go, well, why not? Well, here's the thing, Abel's giving the best from what God had provided him. Cain's giving just some of it. It's sort of like he's picking it out. It wasn't necessarily the best. We don't know if it was the worst, but he wasn't putting a lot of effort into thanking God for what God had provided. So even though people work for things, so obviously Cain was having to work to grow this, um, he was not acknowledging, he was not saying, yeah, I have to admit that God helped with this because I couldn't have done it completely by myself. So that was the first problem he had. And Cain was angry about this because God didn't accept what he gave. God saw this because you know how people are when they get angry and they'll look down, they don't want to look at anyone, and their face looks like they're angry and he's just not wanting to deal with it. And God talks directly to Cain. At this time, even though Adam and Eve sinned and they had to leave the garden, God still talks with them. And he's telling Cain, look, why are you angry? You know, you provide your best and then things will be fine. But sin is crouching at the door waiting to overwhelm you. You don't want that to happen. And so he's warning Cain, you know, he shouldn't be angry and to get past it and do what is right. Well, we find pretty soon that Cain just isn't a good person. And we can't say that Adam and Eve were at fault for that. They were overjoyed to have a child. We know that Eve actually said that. And the fact that Abel came along and he um, reveres God, he wants to do for God what he can, shows that the fault is not with the parents, it's with what Cain decides to do. Well, Cain is angry at God, but he's also angry at Abel because he's very jealous that Abel's getting all this positive attention, and so he says, "Oh, come out with me to the field." Well, Abel has no idea what's going on, and he goes out with him, and Cain attacks his own brother and kills him. And I guess he's kind of pleased with himself, and he goes off. Well, God shows up and says, "Oh, Cain, where's your brother?" Now, this sounds a lot like when Adam and Eve were hiding from God, and he starts calling out to them. Well, Cain is not even sorry that he did what he did. And he goes, am I my brother's keeper? That's kind of like somebody telling you, well, am I your mother? How would, you know, I'm not responsible for this. Don't ask me. And God says, listen to you. What have you done? The blood of your brother is crying out to me from the ground. Now, this is what's going to happen to you. Nothing you try to grow will ever grow again. And you're out of here. And now that something bad is happening to Cain, now he's sorry and he's going, oh, you know, how can I live? You know, anyone who finds me is going to kill me. God says, no, I'm going to put a mark on you. So it was something visible. He put some kind of mark on Cain and said, no, anyone kills you, I'm going to do it even worse to them. Well, what's worse than killing them? Well, there is further punishment that can occur after one dies, and we won't get into that today, but just that's a way of knowing that no one's going to mess with Cain. And you go, who's going to do that? Adam and Eve? Yeah. Well, you have to remember, Cain and Abel have grown up, and we don't know how old they were at the time because think about it, people lived a whole lot longer back then, so they would have had other children. In fact, they would be having lots of children all along. And some of them, well, we know Abel's a good guy. He's trying to follow God. They would naturally, the other brothers and sisters would naturally have been drawn toward Abel and love him. And so they're ones that would probably say, if I see Cain, I'm taking him out. And I don't mean just beating him up. So now they're going to know, don't mess with Cain. Now, we hear a little bit more of the story of Cain, and he goes off, and eventually he's going to have offspring of his own, children of his own later. And you start thinking, wait a second, how can he live? Because they aren't allowed to eat meat at this time, and he can't grow anything. Well, Cain is doomed to wander the earth. And what you would want to know from this is that when we talk about uh, primitive peoples, ones who have not advanced very far with technology or just living very basic lives, certain tribes would be called hunter gatherers, meaning that they would gain their food by hunting animals down or gathering what they could find growing. Well, this time hunting's not allowed, so Cain would have had to wander around in order to gather what food he could find and just hope that he found enough to keep himself going. And apparently he did because he ended up having children and grandchildren and so forth. And we don't know much about what ended up happening to Cain, but we do know that his offspring was a mixture of people who came up with some very nice things culturally, like working metal or music and all, but they seem to not want to follow God. They seem to have nothing to do with God at any point. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind is they are too much like Cain. They take on some of his traits. And that's kind of a warning to us that sometimes we may have to break away from uh, our past or the influence of bad people, maybe even in our own family, in order to turn to God and follow Him. Um, but there is hope in the end because Adam and Eve have another son and they name him Seth, and he is to replace Abel. And it is through Seth that we find the line going all the way down through history and coming through Jesus and on up to the present day. So if the devil was behind this and prompting Cain to do evil things by killing Abel, he was unsuccessful because Seth was able to take Abel's place. And a lesson in all of this is that we do not want to let our anger to control us or to push us into doing things we should not do. Otherwise, we may end up like Cain and end up doing something we can't recover from. There's always forgiveness in God, but there are always consequences as well from doing wrong. So, with that, I'm going to let you go. Today's tie is to show you billiard balls, and in this case, there are a lot of them that are used in playing pool. The 8 ball has this reputation because of the way the game is played as being bad, and a lot of times bad people are called 8 balls, or people who are stuck with them are behind the 8 ball. This is Cain, as I see it. You have others out there who are fine. Of course, there's another 8 ball, but that could be one of his offspring. So don't be Cain. Don't be like Cain. All right. Hope to see you next time and talk to you then. Bye.